Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie McGrath, and I'm with Forbes Breaking News. Hurricane Milton is barreling towards the Florida coast, and it is estimated to cause north of $50 billion in damages, depending on how it hits. This Category 5 storm could be catastrophic. It's been called a once-in-a-century storm. Joining us now to talk about disaster relief is Jeffrey Schlegelmilch. He is the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia Climate School. Jeffrey, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with the numbers, because I just said north of 50 billion, but there are Wall Street reports that put the figure that Milton could cause in damages at 60 billion. There's another report that says 175 billion for Tampa Bay alone and another 70 billion for Fort Myers. We know this is a Category 5 storm. We know that it is a once-in-a-century hit, potentially. How bad could this be?
The short answer is bad. I guess the tougher question is how bad. And with these wild swings in terms of the economic damage estimates, I think it reflects a lot of the uncertainty around this. Now, there's different methodologies that may just look at property damage, others that may look at cascading sort of economic disruption. But there's also a lot of things we don't know yet. So how high the storm surge is in Tampa Bay. This is a very populated area with a lot of infrastructure. So the difference of a couple of feet could be the difference in several $billion. The path that the storm takes, the amount of rainfall that falls, these are all things that we just don't know yet. I should say, too, even in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene in the early days, we're also still seeing wild swings between the total economic damage as the picture comes into full view. So these estimates are striking. They make sense. Exactly how bad it is, I think, depends on what happens over the next 48 hours or so.
You mentioned Helene, and we've been talking to AccuWeather meteorologists about how Florida and other parts of the country have barely recovered from Helene. But let's focus on the Florida coast. What's your assessment of how well they've cleared debris from Helene in anticipation of Milton?
Yeah, so the short answer is there just has not been enough time to remove the debris. And they've recently called off the removal of debris. They've had to send their contractors out of harm's way and really just focus on evacuation and managing that. I heard a number earlier today, something like 5%. That makes sense. Debris management, removal of debris is actually one of the most time-consuming and expensive parts of those very early days of recovery. And unfortunately, there just hasn't been enough time to get a lot of this out of the roadways and get it in places so it won't be blown around. So it just adds a whole nother layer of hazards and things that could impact with the winds and the floodwaters of Milton.
When you say 5%, does that mean only 5% of the debris from Helene has been cleared, or 5% remains?
No, it has been cleared. So
5%.
Very top and bucket. So these estimates, there just isn't enough time to get out there and to remove the sheer magnitude of debris that's created from storms like this. It takes weeks and months to sort of get out and get into staging areas, and even longer to take out of the area and sort of take it to its final resting place. So there just hasn't been nearly enough time.
In your experience, how rare is this, and how concerned are you? It seems like the debris that remains on the ground adds a significant component to what's happening with Milton.
It does, and I think the debris is also a recognition that there's a lot of homes that are still very vulnerable, a lot of people that are still, in just the very, very early stages of recovery, and these aren't even the areas that were hardest hit by Helene. But it adds another hazard to the response. It adds another thing that can clog a roadway, more debris that can be blown around, and so it certainly complicates the response, and also shows us that Tampa and these areas in Florida, they're not just getting ready to respond to an oncoming hurricane, they're still getting back up after a very recent hurricane that has caused significant damage.
Now, turning our attention to FEMA, there has been a lot of politicization around this agency, around disaster relief that comes from the government. Can you talk about the misinformation that's out there? I know FEMA had to put out a fact sheet on its website to kind of battle some of the false claims. And I don't know, let's start broadly. Is the misinformation that's floating around just because people don't understand what FEMA does, or is it a deliberate attempt to mislead parts of the public by certain politicians?
I would say, unfortunately, I have to say it's probably a little bit of both. We always do see misinformation in disasters. We see it being perpetuated by people, sometimes from a fundamental misunderstanding of how things work. A lot of decisions that are made at the state and local level with the federal government supporting. There have been misinformation that we've seen that we're seeing again, where if you apply for assistance, that means your property can be seized, and none of that is true. But we are seeing this amplified. We're seeing this amplified by sitting elected officials nationally who clearly have an agenda against the current administration. It is an election year. It's very close to the election, and we have seen that disasters can be an influence, particularly the perception of disaster response and disaster recovery in the way that people vote. And so it's unfortunate, but in the circumstances we're in, we're just seeing a lot of this misinformation being amplified and in some cases being created and perpetuated by those rather than really focusing on serving those who are most in need right now.
And of course, that's not a new phenomenon. Former President Bush was attacked for his response to Hurricane Katrina, so we've seen this before. What's your assessment of how the Biden and Harris administration has responded to Helene and is responding or will respond to Hurricane Milton?
Absolutely, and I think I would differentiate to the misinformation versus the legitimate criticism of response, because there's always lessons to be learned and always things that can be done better. But absolutely, in terms of where the administration is at and where we're at as a nation is, frankly, we're at a breaking point with our emergency management systems. And so I think it's something where, we see agencies like FEMA, but they're certainly not the only one, state agencies and other, having to call on resources from the Department of Defense and other agencies. We see the reserve staff ready to respond in these agencies at all-time lows. We see disaster funds depleted. Some nearly ran out before the continuing resolution from Congress. We see the loan program from the disaster loans from the Small Business Administration dangerously low. So this is all sort of symptoms of a broader problem, which is that we're asking more and more of these agencies in our disaster response, and we're not providing the resources to be able to keep up with that, with the increasing disasters that we're seeing.
I just want to underline something you said. We are at a breaking point for emergency response, emergency management. What led to this breaking point? Is it that federal funds have gotten diverted elsewhere, or is that these disasters are getting bigger and just require more money than the government has allocated?
Well, as a nation, and in particularly through Congress, we've really been ignoring this growing problem of the size and the scope of disasters that we have. It's worth noting that, that while climate change is certainly a factor in terms of the number of disasters that we're seeing, we haven't seen a lot of that attention going into increased funding to prevent the impacts of climate change. We've seen some of that in this administration through some of the investments in infrastructure through the bipartisan infrastructure law. We've seen this FEMA administrator try and include more information on climate change and climate mitigation into requirements for hazard mitigation plans. But we still have a very disjointed system. We have as many as 90 different disaster assistance programs spread across 20 different federal agencies. In addition to that, we have a disaster relief fund, but we've become addicted to emergency supplemental funding. So most of the money we're spending on disaster relief for catastrophic disasters of the scale that we'll see with Helene, but for Katrina, Harvey, and Maria, it's coming from emergency spending outside of the normal budget process. We're dealing with this in an ad hoc emergency response sort of way, rather than stepping back and saying, how do we build this better? How do we get ahead of this trend?
You said 90 different relief programs across 20 federal agencies. Has that always been the case? And should that be the case for the future? Is there, given the scale of Milton, a case to be made for something more streamlined?
Yeah, so it's a huge problem. And let's start by imagining you're one of these survivors who is trying to rebuild your home, and you're getting information on assistance programs and potentially loan programs, and then you're also dealing with your insurance. But then on the other hand, there may be an emergency supplemental fund that activates another round of assistance. So these 90 programs, they don't all get activated at the same time. Some of them literally require an act of Congress. They come with that emergency supplemental funding. And so whether you're a state agency trying to coordinate this, a local agency trying to disperse it, or an individual trying to navigate this, it's impossibly complex, taking assistance from one program could potentially make you ineligible for another. And so it's just a symptom of sort of this, what a colleague of mine calls a Jenga of federal assistance that gets layered on top of every disaster. And so at some point, we have to step back and saying we have to quit putting Band-Aids on the patient and actually figure out what is the underlying problem. So a simplification of emergency management, a consolidation, and really a reimagining of this nationally, I think is something that we're on an inevitable course towards once we all once Congress kind of wakes up and decides to put the time into truly looking at how to better prepare our emergency management agencies for what we're facing.
Is that fractured environment part of why we've heard former President Trump saying that FEMA only gives people $750? Is he referring to one of those many, many programs?
Well, so that is an intentional sort of misdirection in terms of that. So I would hope that a former president has better knowledge of the comprehensiveness of the programs that FEMA offers, especially with multiple declared disasters under his own administration. So $750, there's an immediate assistance package that's offered. And it's, hey, these programs are being activated. Here's some funds to have to buy groceries, buy gas, sort of get you to the point where we can start talking about larger funding and larger programs that are coming after that. So that is one of those programs. But to highlight that, to take that out of context, that's part of the deliberate misinformation that we were talking about.
In terms of those mitigation efforts that you mentioned, I'm curious, if you were to wave a magic wand and grant the federal government the money we would need, ideally, to have a fully comprehensive mitigation effort, how much money would we need to allocate towards that?
That's a good question. It's hard to put a precise number on it, but I'd be thinking in the neighborhood of hundreds of billions of dollars at a minimum. To put that into perspective, we have programs like the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. I believe the last time that was offered, it was around $6 billion. So a pretty big difference between where we need to be and where we're at. We've seen some ground made up with programs like the bipartisan infrastructure law. So a lot of the investments that were billions, tens of billions, in some cases hundreds of billions of dollars put into infrastructure, which included elements of more resilient infrastructure. I believe some estimates I've seen actually get us into the trillions of dollars in terms of what's needed to truly mitigate these these impacts. But if we take a look at what we're spending, and this is another piece, my colleague Ellen Carlin and I have a paper that's in press right now, will come out soon, but we actually try to take a look at what is the emergency spending. And we've been spending hundreds of billions of dollars in emergency supplemental spending on disasters. And if we include COVID, that number is in the trillions of dollars. So already we've outspent what we could conceivably need in terms of putting in the mitigation measures in a very short period of time. So as much as this sounds like a big number for what we need for mitigation to help prevent the impacts of disasters, we're already spending it on the back end, and we're spending it much faster and after people have lost lives and livelihoods as a result of it.
In healthcare, we talk about preventative medicine versus the cure, and sometimes cures can cost more money and give insurance companies and big corporations more money on their bottom line, but the prevention would save the system more money down the line. It sounds like a similar thing could be happening here. But I'm curious, as we talk about some of the critiques of FEMA and some of the concerns around the Disaster Relief Fund, some of what is floating around in the political landscape is money has been given to DEI programs or to immigrants and supporting other communities. Is that what's happening? Does the DRF lack money because it's been diverted to other federal priorities?
No. No, so that's an unequivocal no. So a lot of this is again, more misinformation. I was talking to someone the other day about aid to Ukraine. So Congress authorizes and appropriates the budgets for different lines to FEMA. The Disaster Relief Fund has very specific purposes for responding and supporting ongoing relief and new responses to disasters that emerge. Within FEMA's operating budgets, within training budgets and things like that, there are internal programs. Certainly in terms of emergency aid to Ukraine and things like that, these are different budget lines. You can't, a colleague of mine in the military says there are different colors of money. You can't take money from one line into another without congressional permission to do so. So this is sort of cherry picking numbers from different parts of the federal ledger as if it's interchangeable, and it's just not. It's also worth noting that these DEI programs, that one of the big things that we see in the aftermath of disaster is a widening of inequities. We see that people who are able to access these complex programs tend to be wealthier, tend to be from wider areas. And the administration has done a lot to try to make that access more equitable so that people who need this support from historically disadvantaged communities are better able to access these programs. It's a very, very tall order, but I would also reject any sort of notion that that actually is not related to disaster resilience, because it's actually a major factor, and the data consistently shows that.
As you look at the folks on the ground in Florida, we have people who have evacuated and or are evacuating currently, though time is running out. What is your message to people in the potentially affected communities in Tampa Bay, in Fort Myers? It's individual disaster relief and preparedness, but is there anything that you would give, any words of advice you would give to folks on the ground in Florida?
First and foremost, listen to your emergency management agencies. At the local level, they have the most knowledge on where that risk is. Florida, in particular, has a very robust emergency management system at the county and at the state levels and at the municipal levels, because they get hit a lot. These things, hurricanes are not new to Florida. If they're saying this is not a safe place to be, it's not a safe place to be. And the other thing we always say, too, is that don't assume that the last storm experience is what this experience is going to be like. There are a lot of big concerns with the track that it takes, with the storm surge that this could create, with the debris that's on the ground. And so listen to the experts and the agencies in your community and take the actions that they recommend to be safe. And if the recommendation is to get out, do whatever you can to safely evacuate.
Is there anything else about the impending path of Milton that has you especially concerned or that you have your eye on? You've mentioned the storm surge. Obviously, there will be high winds, 8 to 12, possibly more inches of rainfall in really the center of the path. What do you have your eye on?
How fast it moves at this point, and the models are going to get more and more accurate as it gets closer and closer to landfall, and that time shortens. But unlike Helene, which sort of took a northward path through the country, stalled out, dropped a ton of rain, and sort of kept hitting states until it eventually fizzled out, this is taking an eastward path across Florida, and the faster it moves across, the sooner people can get in for rescue if that's necessary, and the faster it moves across, hopefully the less sort of rainfall and the less time for that surge is there. So those are going to be key factors in this.
I see. So speed I usually associate with velocity, but in this case, speed would be good because it moves faster and just gets relief in sooner.
I should be a little careful about how I say this, because we have had hurricanes like Michael that move very quickly but have ferocious wind speeds. But if we see this die down, and so most of the damage and most of the lives lost, at least in mainland areas from hurricanes, come from flooding. And that flooding comes from storm surge and inland flooding from rainfall. And so, if the storm stalls and stays in one place for a long time, this is what we saw with Hurricane Harvey, with Hurricane Florence, where, and even Hurricane Helene inland is where it sort of hangs out for a while and just is able to just keep dumping rain at historic amounts. The sooner that it gets out there, the sooner that hazard is gone and the sooner that relief can get in, assuming there isn't some other characteristic like really extra ferocious winds and things like that. But I think at this point, it's approaching. The outer bands are already there. It's really a matter of getting through this as quickly and safely as possible.
Jeffrey, is there anything about Hurricane Milton or Hurricane Helene that we're not talking about enough? I know before we started recording here, you mentioned something about flood insurance. Is there, these storms are so big, so complicated, involve so many federal agencies, local agencies, but what aren't we talking about that perhaps we should be?
I think one of the key things with the disasters we're facing is this isn't just in the domain of federal agencies, right? Our economies are wrapped up in this. And so flood insurance is one of these areas where we're seeing flood insurers pulling out of markets because of all of the payouts and all the damage that's being done. We're seeing it, and we're seeing a lot of places that are flooding at historic levels that weren't previously in a floodplain. So a lot of homeowners, a lot of renters don't have flood insurance because they aren't, according to the map, in an area that's at risk, because they take into account historic risk, not projected risk with climate change. Well, what happens when we start tinkering with this and you want to buy a home and it's in an area that has flooding and you can't get insurance, you can't afford insurance, you probably can't get a lender to give you money for it, which means you can't buy that home. Or if you own that home, you can't sell it. That's your greatest source of wealth. It's how we create generational wealth in our families. And so this actually has much broader repercussions that the insurance industry is at the forefront of in terms of the increasing impacts of disasters. But this is actually something that's owned by everyone who does business within the context of these economies, within the context of these communities. And I think there's an opportunity to take a hard look at what are some of these unrecognized risks on sooner as well as longer time horizons, but also what are some of those investments that can be made? How can we better engage the private sector in this investment in resilience, understanding that we're all in this together?
Those are very good questions. And I think my final question to you is, unfortunately, Hurricane Milton might not be the last storm of hurricane season. Meteorologists say that hurricane season technically goes into November. How concerned are you about the rest of the fall from a disaster relief perspective?
Oh, I'm always worried, but I think as we get later into the season and things start to cool off, hopefully we'll see less. But there's a reason hurricane season runs that long, and I think that we'll hope for the best, but we have to prepare that this may not be the last hurricane that we see. We're seeing the Gulf at historically high temperatures. We're seeing the conditions where a lot of these storms form really ripe for additional formation. And even in the absence of that, we know that we're just seeing, other types of events. We're seeing storms, we're seeing wildfire events. And so we really do just have to sort of step back and really sort of understand risk a little bit differently and understand the value of investing and reducing that risk a lot more fully.
Jeffrey Schlegelmilch, thank you so much for joining us and breaking this down for us. We so appreciate your time.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.